All right, everybody, welcome back to the YS channel. Your home for movie reviews, the good and the bad, the ugly, and even the masterpieces. Today, we're going to be covering one of the most polarizing Godzilla movies out there called Godzilla vs. Biollante from 1989.
Godzilla vs. Biollante is the sequel to Godzilla 1984, or The Return of Godzilla. Was
hmm
the result of a script contest held by Toho Studios. Turns out a dentist won and had his script adapted. The movie has G fans divided, with some saying it's a good movie, others saying it's a bad movie.
True. And then we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth why it could be both a good or a bad movie. You know, I'll say this about the Godzilla franchise as a whole. There's definitely a good mix of really good and really bad thrown in there. And honestly, this movie's no exception to that.
It's In Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla fights a monster that is a hybrid of plants, Godzilla himself, and a dead woman called Erica, who is killed during a terrorist attack. Her father continues their work by merging the cells of both three into a super monster called Biollante that initially takes the form of a giant rose.
Yep. So this movie technically officially kicks off the Heisei Era for Godzilla films. Some of the characters introduced in this movie will reappear in the future movies within the series. In particular, the character of Miki Saigusa, who uses ESP or telepathy to bond with Godzilla. This is also the only movie in the series to acknowledge Godzilla 1984. Moving forward, there's like no reference to that particular film.
Right. In a Godzilla 1984, Godzilla is lured into a volcano on Mount Mihara. Suddenly, he meets his demise, but Biollante, he is basically alive and well, waiting for the moment to reemerge from the volcano. The suit for Godzilla in this movie would come to define the creature, and is generally the design used for most merchandising as of today. Dubbed the Bio-Goji suit, it came out of necessity when the 1984 suit went missing, and delays for the sequel continued, which would have led that suit to be deteriorated, as Godzilla suits tend to not to survive long in storage.
That is true. They don't have a good track record of surviving storage for very long. Anyhow, the design for this particular Godzilla for this movie would be tweaked over the course of the rest of the Heisei series, but it remains one of the most consistent and iconic designs of the Godzilla monster. You know, even current films in this franchise, such as Shin Godzilla and even Godzilla Minus One, borrow elements from the design. Godzilla Minus One definitely has a more closer resemblance to it. And as you already said, a lot of the merchandising that still comes out to this day is primarily focused on the Heisei Era design of the monster suit. It's a pretty damn good design.
Yeah, it's actually my second favorite design of the suit because my personal favorite is the suit used in Mothra versus Godzilla. For some reason, I just like how Godzilla was designed in that movie. But anyway, back to business. In Godzilla vs. Biollante, they actually had an increased budget from the previous movie, and they actually put it to good use.
Yeah. So while Godzilla is still a man in a suit, and in certain scenes they use animatronic puppets for like close-ups and everything, Biollante in her flower form and final form was a controlled giant puppet using multiple piano strings and wires. One of the most iconic shots happens in the final battle when Biollante charges at Godzilla, and that was achieved entirely using wires and no man in a suit, which it's actually a really well shot scene considering all the nature of the props and everything used in it. You know, it's pretty convincing looking.
Yeah, well, at the heart of this movie is a story about science being misused and corporate espionage. And American companies, after the Godzilla cells, while a Middle Eastern country called Somalia wants known to be used to make crops that could grow in the desert, thus
Mhm.
threatening the American grain industry. Japan wants to use the Godzilla cells to make a weapon called anti-nuclear bacteria that could kill Godzilla and radiation in general. When things go awry, Somalia sends an assassin to kill anything that oppose their country's plans. While GMO foods and bioweapons were one part of the story, Godzilla vs Biollante was ahead in another field of warfare.
Yes. So just like how it tackles GMO foods and then corporate espionage, or I guess corporate, you know, like science being corrupted by corporate greed kind of issues, right? It does tackle the concept of drone warfare long before, it dominated the headlines and the war zones as it does today. In 1989, they were still a brand new technology. And then in Godzilla 1984, Godzilla goes against the JASDF Flying Fortress Super X and topples a skyscraper on top of it. And then learning from that failure, the JASDF introduces the Super X2, which is remote controlled and uses a fire mirror to like reflect Godzilla's atomic breath back at him. While novel and using the drone instead of risking lives, the Super X2 is defeated by Godzilla when he melts the fire mirror, because no puny toy is going to stop Godzilla.
That's right. Plot of this movie is kind of all over the place, but the story itself is one of the most original Godzilla movies, and definitely the most original story within the Heisei era, which would dumb down the content following Biolante's failure at the box office.
That is true. With the concept of this story and the way they told it, they took a lot of risk, for a Godzilla movie, right? And that's why it's so polarizing amongst Godzilla fans in general. First of all, the kaiju, the Biollante monster, is one of the very few, to be classified as a female gender, which it's like a big deal amongst kaiju nerds, right? Especially at that time. And then it's the whole concept of like merging Godzilla's cells with plant biology and all that, and it gets kind of like possessed by the spiritual essence of the lady Eriko, right? It's kind of a what the fuck kind of thing. But for the time period, I think they pulled it off pretty well. The Heisei series does get a little hokey, especially the further you progress into it. And this movie is also sort of hokey, especially if you watch like the English dubbed version of it, But as you already said and elaborated on, it is definitely the best story of the Heisei series, maybe except for Godzilla vs. Destroyer. It's definitely the most original one, that's for sure. They would revisit this concept with Space Godzilla, where you take the Godzilla cells into space, and you get a space clone. Instead of a plant clone, which is what Biollante really is. It's just like a plant clone of Godzilla. You get Space Godzilla from space. But fortunately, this movie did tank in the box office, which is what motivated and prompted Toho Studios with the future releases in the Heisei series to stick Godzilla against familiar foes, Mothra, Mechagodzilla, King Ghidorah, to help juice up the box office numbers. And I would say they had pretty good success doing it and everything. Now, because of this movie's polarizing nature, it's definitely within the Godzilla, like the realm of the Godzilla fandom, it does have a strong cult presence or cult following in general. Again, I think the story was told decently. To me, it's one of the better movies in the overall in the Toho Godzilla series, period. Right? I mean, it's not perfect, but it's one of the better ones, that's for sure. Like,
It's actually my favorite. It's actually my favorite film in the whole series. That's how I view it. It has
yeah,
its issues, but I like the story and stuff.
yeah. I mean, my personal favorite of the whole series, or at least the Heisei series, is the final entry, Godzilla versus Destroyer. But that's just like eye candy. You get burning Godzilla versus a giant reptilian crab monster that's bored from the oxygen destroyer. Whereas this one, he fights a giant plant possessed by the spirit of some like dead chick, which I can see why that turns some people off. But I mean, it is an original story, like completely original. And you gotta give Toho credit for that. Because they're not known for really taking giant risks with this series. They might take a couple risks here or there, and then they go back to familiar territory. Like when they ended the Heisei series, right? I could have any years passed, but then there was Godzilla 2000, which, other than they gave Godzilla like an edgelord design, they didn't change anything else, really. And then he went back to fighting Mothra, Mechagodzilla, and King Ghidorah all over again. So, like, they were just rehashing old shit. Now, Shin Godzilla, to me, I know we're going a little far off track here. Shin Godzilla, I feel like they took some risk. I mean, they still rehashed the origin story of Godzilla once again, because it is a retelling of the Godzilla origin story. But I mean, the way like they presented it, they took a lot of risk, and it paid off. And then, Godzilla minus one. As far as like a narrative, the only risk they took is they make this one predate what has been the established like norm for like what is considered the perfect Godzilla, right? But this one, Godzilla vs Biollante, they introduced cloning and spiritual possession, kind of been present in the whole series, or at least in the show era. Because you got to remember, like, when they brought Mothra into the Godzilla series, she was always accompanied by those fucking fairies. And then
Yeah.
I would have to go back and rewatch some of these movies, but I'm pretty sure some characters had like some kind of telepathic psychic connection with some of the monsters, especially Godzilla, like the human characters. It's not that far up.
I know King Ghidorah's first appearance in the 60s, he had like a herald or some woman that basically was like linked to the creature or something. Like she
Yeah.
survived the plane crash or something, and she was like speaking on behalf of King
Yeah.
Ghidorah.
She's basically Asian Silver Surfer. um, but yeah. Whereas this one, like that like concept isn't new. So like I know some people kind of bash this one for that, but it's like it's not a new concept. I mean, you could bash maybe the way it was handled to an extent, but at the end of the day, Godzilla Biollante offers a deeply like emotional story. And you gotta give them praise for that. Like it is an emotional story, and as I already said before, they tell it pretty well. And then just consequences from this movie that were felt for the rest of the series. Like I mentioned before, the whole concept of Godzilla's cells being used to create other monstrosities will revisit itself when Space Godzilla turns up. And then Destroya is like a bastardized version of it, I mean, it's not a clone per se, but it's like a very bastardized fucking, birth of a monster and everything. And then as far as spiritual and telepathic connections. Again, they introduced the psychic girl in this movie, which is one of the things that I don't like about the Heisei series. Even though like she does offer some valid exposition throughout the series, but I'm like, come on, like just get fucking squashed already. And then they bring back Mothra and the fairies, so there's that. So with all that out of the way, you got any additional closing thoughts?
I would say this. I think I think Godzilla vs. Biollante, as you said, was a movie that took risk. The risk didn't pay off financially for Toho Studios, but they took another shot of completing the franchise, which became the Heisei se series, and over the course of the decades, movie's reception has improved somewhat because people at first didn't care for the movie, but now they like the movie because it was ahead of its time dealing with subject matters like drone warfare, dream modes, and basically had a very interesting story, but the story got muddled through the editing process, the direction, and the scripting. But I think the story itself had it been perfected, it could have been an even better movie. This movie could have been what Godzilla Minus One was in the 80s, had Toho Studios taken more care with the subject matter and the script. But
True.
in the end, we got what we got. But I think the movie's most important legacy is not really its cult status. It's also the character's design because that is the look of Godzilla almost ever since.
True. Now, with that said, nothing more else to add. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like our reviews, drop a like and subscribe. We appreciate it as always. Later. All right, dude, I gotta take a shit. So,
All right.
good job.